I never thought my childhood passion for collecting vintage toys and memorabilia would one day be worth a small fortune. But when my stepfather Walter decided my collection was nothing but worthless junk taking up space in our basement, he donated everything while I was away at college. 6 years later, Walter's construction company is on the verge of bankruptcy, and he needs a $250,000 loan. What he doesn't know is that the junk he so carelessly threw away was appraised at over $900,000 last year. And I've spent the past 5 years secretly rebuilding my collection, piece by precious piece. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in Mapleton, Ohio, I was always the odd one out. While other girls my age were concerned with the latest fashion trends or which boy band member they'd marry someday, I was scouring garage sales and flea markets every weekend with my dad, James. He had instilled in me a love for what he called the overlooked treasures of yesterday. "Emma," he'd say, examining an old baseball card or a forgotten action figure still in its packaging, "most people can't see the value in these things, but that's their loss and our gain. Remember, today's trash is tomorrow's treasure." Dad had been a history teacher with a particular fascination for pop culture artifacts. Our modest ranch-style home gradually filled with carefully curated display cases of vintage toys, rare comic books, limited edition collectibles, and memorabilia from the 60s through the 90s. Each item had a story, and Dad knew them all. "This Star Wars figure," he'd explain, holding up a small plastic Boba Fett, was part of a mail-in promotion in 1979. They made very few with this particular rocket-firing backpack before recalling them for safety concerns. Now there are collectors who would pay thousands just for this 3-inch piece of plastic. Our collection became our special bond. Every Saturday morning, we'd wake up early, grab breakfast at Donna's Diner, and then hit every yard sale, estate, auction, and thrift store within a 30-mile radius. Dad taught me to spot undervalued items, to negotiate fairly but firmly, and most importantly, to preserve the historical significance of each piece. "We're not just collectors, Emma," he'd remind me. "We're curators of cultural history." Everything changed when I was 14. Dad's sudden heart attack left Mom and me devastated. Catherine Monroe, once vibrant and full of laughter, became a shadow of herself. The medical bills piled up quickly, and Mom took on extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. The collection, which had once been a source of joy, became a painful reminder of Dad's absence. 2 years after Dad's death, Mom introduced me to Walter Simmons. He was everything Dad wasn't: practical, business-minded, and utterly uninterested in useless trinkets, as he called them. Walter owned a successful construction company and lived in the affluent part of town. His world revolved around concrete, numbers, profit margins, and real assets. "You can't build a future on toys and comic books," he'd tell me with a dismissive laugh whenever he caught me organizing or cataloging the collection. Despite my reservations, I couldn't deny that Walter made Mom happy again. Her smile, which had been absent for so long, returned. For that alone, I tried to accept him. When they announced their engagement after just 10 months of dating, I forced myself to be supportive. The wedding was small but elegant, and within a month, Mom and I had moved into Walter's sprawling colonial home across town. My collection, now grown to fill dozens of carefully labeled storage bins, was relegated to a corner of his finished basement. "Just until we figure out what to do with all this stuff," Walter had promised, though the way his lip curled when looking at my meticulously preserved action figures and sealed comic books made his true feelings obvious. Throughout high school, I continued to expand the collection using the money I earned working part-time at the local comic book shop. The owner, Mr. Russo, recognized my knowledge and passion, often setting aside valuable items for me before putting them on display. By my senior year, I had added several rare pieces that even Dad would have been impressed by, a near-mint amazing. Fantasy the Mother 15, first appearance of Spider-Man. a complete set of first edition Harry Potter books signed by J.K. Rowling, and an original 1978 holiday special Star Wars poster that had never been unfolded. I kept a detailed inventory in a leather-bound journal, complete with photographs, purchase dates, and estimated values. According to my research, even then, the collection was worth upwards of $300,000. Though Walter scoffed when I once mentioned this figure. Fantasy numbers, he'd dismissed. No one's going to pay real money for plastic toys and paper books. Real investments are in property, stocks, businesses, things with actual value. 2 weeks before I left for Syracuse University, where I'd earned a scholarship to study art history and museum studies, I spent an entire weekend organizing the collection. I created a comprehensive catalog, took photographs of each item, and carefully repacked everything in archival quality containers. Walter watched from the doorway, shaking his head. "All this effort for junk," he muttered. "When you're done playing with toys, you might want to consider a degree in something practical." I ignored him, focusing instead on ensuring every piece was properly protected and documented. What I didn't know then was that this would be the last time I would see my collection intact, the collection that represented not just monetary value, but the precious memories of Saturday mornings with Dad, the stories behind each careful acquisition, and the legacy he had entrusted to me. "I'll be back for Thanksgiving," I told Mom as she hugged me goodbye on move-in day at the dorm. "Make sure Walter doesn't touch my stuff, okay?" She laughed, thinking I was joking. "Of course, honey. Everything will be waiting right where you left it." Neither of us could have predicted how wrong she would be. My first semester at Syracuse flew by in a blur of lectures, new friendships, and late-night study sessions. I'd chosen to double major in art history and museum studies, fields that Walter had mockingly called professional collecting. Despite his disapproval, I excelled in my courses, particularly those focused on cultural artifacts and preservation techniques. Professor Winters, my cultural artifacts instructor, took a special interest in me after I submitted a detailed analysis of vintage toy valuation trends from 1980-2000. "Most students choose to write about fine art or archaeological specimens," she noted with approval. "Your perspective on pop culture memorabilia as historical artifacts is refreshing." As Thanksgiving approached, I eagerly packed for my first trip home. I'd discovered several collectors' forums online and was excited to share the new valuation information I'd learned about some of my rarer pieces. The reunion with Mom was warm, though Walter merely nodded a greeting before returning to his football game. Our new house had never felt like home to me, but I was eager to retreat to the basement and spend time with the collection that connected me to Dad. "Oh, before I forget," Mom said as she prepared dinner, "we did some reorganizing while you were gone. The basement looks so much better now." Something in her tone made my stomach drop. "What kind of reorganization?" "Well, Walter hired a company to finish the basement properly. It's like a real family room now, with a big TV and everything. You'll love it." I abandoned my unpacked suitcase and rushed downstairs. The transformation was immediate and jarring. Where once stood my meticulously organized shelving units and storage containers, there was now an oversized sectional sofa, a massive flat screen, and a wet bar. Every trace of my collection had vanished. "Mom!" I screamed, racing back upstairs. "Where is everything? Where's my collection?" Mom's face fell. Walter entered the kitchen, his expression a mixture of defensiveness and dismissal. "Your mother and I decided it was time to reclaim that space," he announced. "You're an adult now in college. It didn't make sense to keep all those childish things." "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What did you do with my collection?" "We donated it," Mom said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "To the Children's Hospital and Goodwill." Walter thought, "You what?" The room seemed to spin around me. That collection was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was my inheritance from Dad, Walter scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Emma. No one pays that kind of money for toys. We needed the space. and I wasn't going to pay for storage for a bunch of... It wasn't yours to give away. I screamed, tears streaming down my face. You had no right. That was my property. You're being ungrateful, Walter said firmly. We've given you everything. A nice home, college tuition. I'm on scholarship, I shot back. And that collection was my future. It was irreplaceable. I turned to Mom, desperate for her to understand. How could you let this happen? Dad and I spent years building that collection. It was all I had left of him. The pain in her eyes was genuine, but so was her loyalty to Walter. Honey, we thought it was just stuff. Walter said you'd outgrown it. Walter doesn't know anything about me, I said coldly. And apparently, neither do you anymore. I stormed upstairs, packed my barely unpacked bag, and called an Uber. Mom followed me, pleading for me to stay, to talk it through. But there was nothing to discuss. My trust had been shattered alongside my heart. When did you do it? I asked as I waited. By the door. When exactly did you throw away my future? Walter appeared behind Mom. About a month ago. Look, if it means that much to you, I'll write you a check for $1,000. That's more than generous for... Keep your money, I spat. I don't want anything from you. The Uber arrived, and I left without looking back, spending Thanksgiving break in my deserted dorm. When my roommates returned and found me still devastated, they helped me take action. Melissa, a pre-law student, confirmed that I had a legitimate, legal claim since the collection had been my documented property. You could sue them, she suggested, especially since you have that inventory journal with photos and valuations. But litigation would mean destroying what remained of my relationship with Mom. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to do that. Instead, I channeled my grief into something constructive. I reached out to Mr. Russo at the comic shop back home, explaining what had happened. His response came quickly. Emma, this is terrible news. I might be able to help track down some pieces. The collecting community is tight-knit. If those items hit the market, someone will notice. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Over winter break, I stayed with my roommate's family rather than going home. Mom called daily, her messages increasingly desperate as she realized the depth of the damage done. Walter, predictably, remained convinced he'd done nothing wrong. It's just stuff, Emma, he insisted during one particularly tense phone call. Material possessions shouldn't come between families. Those material possessions were my connection to Dad, I replied coldly. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You've spent your entire life thinking value only comes from practical things. I declined their invitation for Christmas dinner, spending the holiday instead at a small collectors' convention in Boston, where Mr. Russo had helped me secure a vendor pass. There, amidst people who understood the value of what I had lost, I made a decision that would shape the next 5 years of my life. If Walter had destroyed my past, I would rebuild my future, one piece at a time. And I would do it without him ever knowing. I opened my laptop that night in the hotel room and created a spreadsheet. Column by column, I listed every item from my memory and the detailed inventory I'd kept in my journal. Next to each entry, I added current market values based on recent sales. The final figure made me physically ill, $427,000. And that was a conservative estimate, not accounting for the continued appreciation of vintage collectibles. I couldn't get everything back. Some pieces had been genuinely rare, virtually irreplaceable, but I could start again. I had my knowledge, my passion, and most importantly, a determination fueled by Walter's betrayal. As I started my second semester, I landed a part-time job at the university's Special Collections Library and picked up weekend shifts at a local auction house. Every dollar I earned beyond basic expenses went into a dedicated account labeled simply Reclamation. What's your goal? Asked Jackson, a fellow student at the auction house who had become a trusted friend after hearing my story. I showed him the spreadsheet on my phone, now organized by acquisition priority. "I'm going to rebuild what was taken from me," I explained. "And someday, Walter is going to realize exactly what he threw away." I couldn't have known then just how literal that realization would become. 5 years after Walter's betrayal, I stood in my climate-controlled storage unit surveying the fruits of my determination. The 10x20 space-housed glass display cases, archival storage bins, and security systems that would impress most museums. This wasn't just a collection anymore. It was my vindication. After graduating with honors, I leveraged my dual degree in art history and museum studies to secure a position at the Callaway Museum of Popular Culture in Boston. My specialized knowledge of 20th century collectibles had made me a valuable asset to their acquisitions team. "Emma, these authentication skills of yours are uncanny," my boss, Director Abigail Harmon, often remarked. "I've never seen someone your age with such an eye for detail." Little did she know that my expertise had been forged through necessity. Each authentication technique I mastered, each market trend I analyzed, served dual purposes, advancing my career while enabling me to strategically rebuild what Walter had destroyed. My approach to reclaiming my collection was methodical. I maintained 2 separate acquisition streams: the official purchases made through my museum connections, and the shadow purchases conducted through a network of trusted collectors operating under strict confidentiality. Mr. Russo had become my most valuable ally, acting as my eyes and ears in collector circles nationwide. "Emma, you'll never believe what just showed up at an estate sale in Cincinnati," he'd text, often at odd hours. "Prototype Star Wars figure, matches the description of one from your list, sending photos now." These moments brought bittersweet triumph. Each recovered item represented a small victory, but also reopened the wound of what had been taken. Nevertheless, piece by painstaking piece, my collection began to rebuild, sometimes with the very items Walter had discarded. "This Batman promotional figure still has your price sticker on the bottom," Jackson noted during one of his visits to help me catalog new acquisitions. Now working as an appraiser for a major auction house, he occasionally provided professional valuations for insurance purposes. I turned the figure over, and there it was, my teenage handwriting on a faded label. Gotham Knight Limited Edition, mint $85. The sight brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "How did you find this exact piece?" Jackson asked gently. "It was donated to the Children's Hospital," I explained. "A nurse there remembered it because her son was a Batman fan. She connected me to the family who'd taken it home. I paid them 5 times its current value as a finder's fee, never explaining its true significance. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times over the years. The collecting community, once aware of my story, became unexpected allies in my quest." My relationship with Mom remained strained. We spoke occasionally, usually on birthdays and holidays, but our conversations were superficial. She never visited my apartment in Boston, and I returned to Mapleton only when necessary, staying at hotels rather than the house where Walter reigned supreme. During these visits, I carefully maintained the fiction that I'd moved on from collecting. In reality, my restored collection had grown beyond even what Walter had discarded, curated with the professional expertise I developed at the museum. 3 years into my rebuilding effort, I received an unexpected call from a private collector. "In Seattle, Ms. Monroe, this is Theodore Kent. I understand you might be interested in a particular comic book I recently acquired. Amazing Fantasy number 15, near mint condition." My heart raced. This had been one of the crown jewels of my original collection, worth over $50,000 alone. "May I ask how you obtained it?" I asked cautiously. "Purchased from a dealer in Ohio who acquired it from a Goodwill auction. The provenance is unusual. Most copies this well-preserved don't end up in donation bins." I closed my eyes, picturing Walter carelessly tossing the protective case into a donation box. "What are you asking for?" Market value is around $85,000. Now, but I understand this copy might have personal significance to you. Mr. Russo had clearly been working on his connections. What did he tell you? Enough to know this isn't just a business transaction. I'm a collector myself, Ms. Monroe. If someone discarded my life's work, he paused. Let's say I'm motivated to see it return to its rightful owner. I'll accept $65,000, still profitable for me but below market. It would deplete most of my savings, but this wasn't just about money. Deal. 2 weeks later, I held in my gloved hands the exact comic that Dad had given me for my 16th birthday. The distinct watermark in the upper right corner confirmed it was mine, a tiny imperfection that made it uniquely precious. By my 5th year of collecting, an unexpected pattern emerged in my professional life. My reputation for authentication and valuation had spread beyond the museum world. Private collectors, insurance companies, and even legal firms sought my expertise in determining the value of pop culture memorabilia. You should start your own consulting business, suggested Abigail during my performance review. The museum could still retain your services part-time, but you're leaving money on the table by not monetizing your skills in the private sector. The idea took root quickly. Within 6 months, Monroe Authentication Services was established, operating from a small office in downtown Boston. The business grew rapidly, fueled by the booming collectors market and my increasingly recognized expertise. Each consulting fee accelerated my rebuilding efforts. By the end of that year, my restored collection's value had surpassed $750,000, far exceeding the original. More importantly, I'd established myself as an authority in a field Walter had dismissed as worthless. I maintained my secrecy about the collection, even as my professional reputation grew. The few people who knew the full story, Jackson, Mr. B. Russo, and a handful of trusted collector allies, understood the importance of discretion. As far as Mom and Walter knew, I had a successful museum career and a side business appraising collectibles. They had no idea of the true scale of either. The validation came not just from rebuilding what was lost, but from transforming my childhood passion into professional success. Every appraisal I conducted, every authentication certificate I signed, felt like a direct rebuttal to Walter's dismissal of my junk collection. My mother called one evening as I was documenting a newly acquired set of 1960s Marvel trading cards. "Emma, how are you? It's been months since we talked." "I'm fine, Mom. Busy with work?" My tone remained coolly polite, as it had for years. "I saw an article about you online. Something about you authenticating some famous movie prop. I didn't understand all of it, but it sounded impressive. It had been a significant project, verifying the authenticity of original props from the
1977 Star Wars film for an auction that made national news. The irony wasn't lost on me that Walter had once mocked my Star Wars collectibles as worthless.
"It was just work," I deflected. "Walter and I were thinking of visiting Boston next month," she ventured hesitantly. "Maybe we could see your office? Get dinner?" The thought of Walter in my professional space, still unaware of what his actions had cost me or how I'd rebuilt from his destruction, stirred something unexpected within me. Not anger, as I would have predicted, but anticipation. "Sure," I heard myself saying. "Let me know when you'll be in town." I hung up, looking around at my storage unit filled with the carefully reconstructed collection. Perhaps it was finally time for Walter to understand exactly what he had thrown away, and what I had reclaimed through my own efforts despite him. What I couldn't have anticipated was the timing of their visit, or the financial crisis that would bring Walter to my doorstep not just as an unwelcome visitor, but as a desperate man in need of exactly the kind of help I was uniquely positioned to provide, or withhold. 2 weeks before Mom and Walter's scheduled visit to Boston, I received an unusually tense call from Mom. "Emma, Honey, I don't think. We'll be able to make it after all, she said, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. Something's come up with Walter's business. Is everything okay? I asked, professional curiosity overriding our personal distance. A pause. Just some temporary cash flow issues. Nothing serious. Her tone betrayed the lie. My connections in Mapleton were limited, but I still had lunch with Mr. Russo whenever I visited. That evening, I called him for insight. Walter's company is in serious trouble, he confirmed, dropping his voice though no one else was in his shop. The Lakeside Estates project collapsed when they found contaminated soil on the property. Environmental remediation costs wiped out their profit margin, and now 3 subcontractors are suing for non-payment. The Lakeside Estates development had been Walter's most ambitious project, luxury condominiums on what was once industrial property. He'd leveraged everything on its success, touting it as his legacy project at every opportunity. How bad is it? I asked. Bad enough that Mapleton National Bank froze his business line of credit last week. Your mother's still working at the hospital, but rumor has it they've already listed their vacation property on Lake Erie. I processed this information with complicated emotions. Walter's financial empire, the source of his arrogance, the foundation of his dismissal of my financially worthless interests, was crumbling. The irony wasn't lost on me. Thanks for letting me know, I told Mr. Russo. I'll handle it from here. That weekend, I flew to Mapleton without warning Mom or Walter. The changes were immediately visible as I drove through town in my rental car. The large Simmons Construction billboard that had once dominated the highway entrance now featured a project delayed notice plastered across it. Walter's construction vehicles, normally scattered across town at various job sites, sat idle in the company parking lot. I parked outside their house, noting the subtle signs of financial strain. The lawn, once meticulously maintained by a service, showed signs of neglect. The luxury SUV Walter bought Mom 2 Christmases ago was gone, replaced by a modest sedan at least 5 years old. Mom answered the door, her surprise quickly shifting to concern. Emma, what are you doing here? I thought I'd surprise you, I said, embracing her, since you couldn't make it to Boston. Her hug lasted longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement of her need for support. Inside, the house felt different, quieter, tenser. Family photos still lined the walls, including several from their luxury vacations, now seeming like artifacts from another time. Walter emerged from his home office, his confident posture noticeably diminished. Gray had overtaken his temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Emma, he said, the usual dismissive edge in his voice replaced by something almost like humility. This is unexpected. I heard there might be some trouble with the Lakeside project, I said directly, watching his expression darken. News travels fast, he muttered, glancing at Mom. It's just a temporary setback. All businesses have ups and downs. Mom busied herself making coffee, avoiding both our eyes. Emma's doing so well in Boston with her museum work and that authentication business, she said brightly, changing the subject. Monroe Authentication Services, I corrected. We've expanded to 3 full-time employees this year. Turns out there's significant demand for expertise in cultural artifacts and collectibles. The irony landed squarely in the silence that followed. Walter nodded stiffly, the memory of his dismissal of my worthless hobby hanging unspoken between us. Over dinner, I gently probed the extent of their financial situation. Walter, perhaps too worn down to maintain his facade, eventually relented. The environmental remediation will cost $1.8 million before we can even continue construction, he admitted. The bank pulled our financing when the first subcontractor filed suit. We need a capital injection of at least $250,000 to satisfy the immediate creditors and demonstrate financial stability to the bank. And your other assets? I asked. Leveraged for the Lakeside project, he said grimly. The vacation house is on the market, but in this economy, he trailed off, the unspoken reality clear. Mom reached for his hand across the table. "We'll figure it out," she assured him. Through her eyes betrayed her fear. I stayed at a hotel that night, processing what I'd learned. Walter's company wouldn't survive without immediate financial intervention. His decades of business success, his identity as a self-made man, were on the brink of collapse. The next morning, I visited Mr. Russo, who had recently expanded his comic shop to include a dedicated collectibles valuation service. Inspired, he said, by my professional example. "What's your plan?" he asked after we caught up. "You're not seriously considering helping Walter after what he did?" I examined a display case of vintage action figures, considering the question. "I haven't decided yet." "You know, Mr. Russo," said carefully, "your most recent acquisition, that complete set of first-release Transformers figures, just appreciated another 15% after that new movie broke box office records. Your collection's total value must be approaching $900,000 according to Jackson's last formal appraisal," I confirmed. "Nearly 3 times the value of what Walter discarded." Mr. Russo whistled low. "And Walter has no idea?" "None. He still thinks I outgrew collecting after college." Before leaving Mapleton, I made one final stop at the offices of Simmons Construction. The reception area, once bustling with activity, stood eerily quiet. A single secretary answered. Phones, her forced smile failing to mask the tension. Walter seemed surprised when I appeared in his doorway. "Emma? I thought you'd left already." The office told the story his pride wouldn't allow him to share. Blueprints for the Lakeside project covered one wall, now marked with environmental survey flags indicating contaminated areas. On his desk, past due notices and legal documents sat in precarious piles. "I wanted to see the situation for myself," I said, gesturing to the blueprints. "This was supposed to be your legacy project." Walter's shoulders sagged as he gazed at the plans. 30 years of building this company, all hanging by a thread because of one piece of bad luck. "Not luck," I corrected. "Inadequate environmental due diligence." His head snapped up, eyes narrowing at my professional assessment. For a moment, I glimpsed the old Walter, proud, defensive, unwilling to accept criticism. "You think you could have done better?" he challenged. "I think careful. Research and proper valuation are essential before any significant investment," I replied evenly. "That's literally what I do for a living now." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "Your mother's worried sick," he said after a moment, deflating again. "I promised her security, comfort. Now I might lose everything, including our home." I studied him. This man who had so carelessly discarded my treasures, who had dismissed my passion as childish and worthless. Now he stood before me, his own real investments crumbling while mine had flourished. "What will you do?" I asked. "Find investors. If possible, take on a partner. Maybe sell the company outright, though it's worth a fraction of its value with this lawsuit hanging over it." His voice grew hesitant. "Actually, I've been meaning to ask, with your business doing well, if you might consider a loan?" Finished for him, watching the painful admission register on his face. "An investment," he corrected, pride still fighting a losing battle. "Your mother mentioned you've been quite successful. I could offer equity in Simmons Construction." As I drove back to Boston that evening, his awkward proposal echoed in my mind. Walter needed $250,000, and quickly. The same Walter who had thrown away a collection now worth nearly $1 million was asking me to invest in his failing company. The decision before me wasn't just financial. It was the culmination of years of resentment, rebuilding, and personal growth. Would I help the man who had so carelessly destroyed what mattered most to me? Or would I finally reveal exactly what his dismissal of worthless junk had truly cost? Back in Boston, I spent a sleepless night weighing my options. Walter's indirect request for financial assistance had opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through. By morning, I'd made no decision, only a list of conflicting emotions. My office at Monroe Authentication Services occupied the third floor of a renovated factory building in Boston's emerging SoWa district. The space blended industrial elements, with museum-quality display cases featuring rotating exhibits from my own collection, though I presented these simply as on loan from private collectors to visiting clients. "You've got 3 new authentication requests," my assistant Daria announced as I arrived. "The Spielberg production company needs verification on that ET prop by Thursday, and there's a hedge fund manager in Connecticut who claims to have one of the original Honus Wagner baseball cards." "Schedule the ET prop for tomorrow," I instructed, setting my bag down. "The Wagner card will require in-person examination. It's likely a reproduction, but worth checking." The rarest baseball card in existence, a genuine Wagner, could fetch millions. "Also," Daria added, "Jackson called. He said the insurance appraisal is complete and the final report is ready for your review." Jackson had spent the past month conducting a comprehensive valuation of my rebuilt collection for insurance purposes. I'd commissioned the appraisal before, learning of Walter's financial troubles, a routine business procedure that now felt oddly significant. I closed my office door and called him. "Emma," Jackson greeted me warmly. "I was just finalizing your paperwork. The collection's totaling out at $923,500, a 12% increase since last year's appraisal." The figure hung in the air, nearly $1 million in worthless junk. "That's higher than expected," I managed. "The market for vintage sealed items continues to surge," Jackson explained. "Your Star Wars and early Marvel pieces alone account for almost 40% of the total value. Your dad had an incredible eye for what would appreciate." Dad. What would he have advised in this situation? I could almost hear his voice. "Value isn't just about price tags, Emma. It's about what something means to you." "There's something else," I said, filling Jackson in on Walter's situation and implicit request. A weighted silence followed. "That's poetically appropriate," he finally said. "The man who threw away a fortune now needs a fraction of that amount to save himself. The question is whether I should help him. Do you want my professional opinion or my friend's opinion?" "Both." "Professionally? His company is a risky investment with significant liabilities. The environmental remediation costs could spiral, and the lawsuits represent substantial uncertainty. You'd be putting $250,000 into a sinking ship." "And as my friend?" Jackson sighed. "As your friend, I think you need to decide what outcome gives you peace. This isn't about Walter. It's about you. Will helping him bring closure? Will refusing make you feel better or worse? Money aside, what serves your healing?" After hanging up, I opened my laptop and pulled up the digital archive of my original collection, photographs and documentation I'd maintained since rebuilding began. Side by side, I compared what Walter had discarded with what I'd reclaimed, the stark numbers, representing years of dedicated effort. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Walter meeting with the bank tomorrow. Last chance to save company. Please call when you can." The next morning, I asked Daria to clear my afternoon appointments and drove to the climate-controlled storage facility housing my collection. I needed to see it physically, to be surrounded by the tangible evidence of my persistence and success. The first display case contained my reclaimed comic books, including the Amazing Fantasy number 15 I'd recovered from Theodore Kent. Next came the vintage Star Wars figures, some original, some replacements, all meticulously authenticated and preserved. The third case held my video game collection, including sealed first edition releases now worth thousands each. As I moved through the space, a revelation crystallized. This collection represented more than monetary value or even sentimental attachment. It symbolized my refusal to let Walter's dismissal define me. I had transformed his act of destruction into the foundation of my professional identity and financial independence. I pulled out my phone and called an unexpected ally. "Dr. Winters," my former professor answered on the third ring. "Emma, what a pleasant surprise." "I need your advice," I said, explaining Walter's predicament and my dilemma. Professor Winters had become a mentor and friend, one of the few people who understood both the personal and professional dimensions of my collecting journey. "What an extraordinary situation," she mused after I finished. "It's not often life offers such perfect symmetry. The question isn't whether you can help Walter, clearly you can, but whether doing so serves your healing or prolongs your resentment. Am I worried that either choice leaves me stuck in the past?" "Perhaps there's a third option," she suggested. "One that acknowledges both your hurt and your power, while creating a path forward." Our conversation lasted nearly an hour, exploring perspectives I hadn't considered. When I hung up, the outlines of a plan had begun to form. Not just regarding Walter's financial crisis, but addressing the deeper wounds that had defined our relationship. That evening, I called Mom. "How did Walter's bank meeting go?" I asked. "Not well," she admitted, her voice hollow. "They've given him 30 days to secure new financing, or they'll call in the business loans. If that happens—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Financial ruin. "I've been thinking about his proposal," I said carefully. "About potentially helping with Simmons' construction." Her intake of breath was audible. "Really? Oh, Emma, that would be—" "But I need to meet with both of you first," I interrupted. "In person, in Boston. There are conditions we need to discuss." "Conditions?" Her tone shifted slightly. "What kind of conditions?" "Professional ones," I assured her. "I don't make $250,000 investments without proper due diligence." "Of course," she said quickly. "When should we come?" "This weekend." "And Mom?" "I need Walter to bring all his financial documentation, company balance sheets, tax returns, project estimates, everything. This isn't a family favor. It's a business discussion." After hanging up, I sat at my desk for a long time, considering the weight of what I was setting in motion. The plan taking shape wasn't about revenge, though part of me had certainly fantasized about watching Walter squirm. It was about something more profound: recognition and reconciliation. I opened my laptop and began preparing a presentation unlike any I'd created before. By the time Walter and Mom arrived, they would find not just a successful businesswoman considering their financial rescue, but a complete accounting of exactly what Walter's disdain for my childish hobby had cost and created. The weekend would change everything between us, one way or another. The only question was whether Walter could accept the true value of what he had so carelessly discarded, not just the collection itself, but the daughter who had rebuilt it from ashes. Saturday morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. I'd arranged for Mom and Walter to meet me at Monroe Authentication Services rather than my apartment. This needed to be a professional encounter, not a family discussion. I arrived 2 hours early to ensure everything was perfectly prepared. The conference room had been transformed into what I privately thought of as an exhibit of consequences. Along one wall, display cases housed selected pieces from my current collection. On the main table, neatly organized folders contained financial documentation of my business growth, alongside the comprehensive appraisal Jackson had completed. Most importantly, the large monitor displayed my presentation, "The Value of Discarded Potential, a Financial Analysis." "Everything looks ready," Daria confirmed, bringing in a carafe of coffee. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay for the meeting?" "This is something I need to handle personally," I replied, straightening a folder. "But thank you." At precisely 10 a.m., the security desk called up. "Ms. Monroe, your guests have arrived." "Send them up," I instructed, smoothing down my blazer and taking a deep breath. The elevator doors opened to reveal Mom and Walter. They seemed smaller somehow, diminished by circumstance. Mom embraced me warmly while Walter hung back, his eyes immediately scanning the office space with undisguised appraisal. Impressive setup, he noted, taking in the exposed brick walls, museum-quality lighting, and elegant furnishings. Business must be good. It is, I confirmed, leading them to the conference room. Authentication and valuation of cultural artifacts has proven to be a growing market. Walter's steps faltered as he entered the room and noticed the display cases. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the collectibles. "Context for our discussion," I replied. "Please sit down. We have a lot to cover." They took their seats, Walter placing a worn leather portfolio on the table, presumably containing the financial documentation I'd requested. His fingers drummed nervously on its surface. "Before we discuss your proposal," I began, "I need to establish some background information. 6 years ago, when I came home from college for Thanksgiving break, I discovered that my collection of vintage toys, comics, and memorabilia had been donated without my knowledge or consent." Walter shifted uncomfortably. "Emma, that's ancient history. We're here to discuss a business opportunity." "This is business," I interrupted calmly. "I'm establishing a relevant financial context." Mom placed a restraining hand on Walter's arm. "Let her finish, Walter." I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a photograph of my original collection, meticulously organized in the basement of their home. This collection, which Dad and I built over a decade, had an estimated market value at the time of approximately $300,000, I stated. That estimate is conservative, based on authenticated sales records from that period. Walter's face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. "There's no way those toys were worth that much. You're exaggerating to make a point." Rather than argue, I clicked to the next slide. A detailed inventory spreadsheet with item descriptions, condition ratings, and market valuations from 6 years ago. This is the comprehensive catalog I maintained, with documentation of every piece, its provenance, condition, and market value based on verified sales. I turned to face him directly. "I have photos of each item, purchase receipts for many, and third-party authentication for the most valuable pieces." Mom's hand had moved to cover her mouth. "Oh, Emma, we had no idea." "I tried to tell you," I reminded her gently. "Multiple times." Walter leaned forward, studying the spreadsheet with newfound intensity. The businessman in him couldn't help but analyze the figures before him. His expression shifted from skepticism to dawning comprehension. Even if these valuations were accurate, and I'm not saying they were, that was 6 years ago, he said finally. "What's your point?" "My point is about value recognition," I replied, clicking to the next slide. This shows the market appreciation of key collectible categories over the past 6 years. The graph displayed dramatic upward trajectories for vintage comics, Star, Wars memorabilia, and sealed video games, all categories that had featured prominently in my original collection. The items you discarded as worthless junk would today be valued at approximately $650,000, accounting for normal market appreciation, I stated. That's without any additional acquisitions or strategic selling during value peaks. Walter's face had lost all color now. The magnitude of his miscalculation was finally registering. "That's impossible," he whispered, but without conviction. "Actually, it's thoroughly documented," I countered, passing him a folder containing Jackson's detailed market analysis. "My colleague at Christie's auction house prepared this assessment based on verified sales of comparable items." Mom was openly crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "We didn't know, Emma. We thought it was just sentimental value." "Which brings me to the present," I continued, clicking to a new slide titled Monroe Collection, Current Holdings. I gestured to the display cases along the wall. After losing my original collection, I began rebuilding, not just replacing what was lost, but strategically acquiring undervalued pieces with growth potential. I handed them to each other's folder. This is the current appraisal of my rebuilt collection, conducted last month for insurance purposes. Walter opened the folder with visibly trembling hands. The summary page displayed the bottom line in bold. Type 923,500. 900,000. He murmured, looking up at me with genuine shock. From collectibles? From recognizing value where others failed to see it, I corrected. From understanding markets, authentication protocols, and investment, timing, skills I developed because I had to rebuild from nothing. I clicked to the final slide, a side-by-side comparison of Walter's company financials, based on public records, and my business growth over the same period. Monroe Authentication Services generated $1.2 million in revenue last year, with a 38% profit margin, I stated. My hobby didn't just rebuild my collection, it built my career and financial independence. Walter closed the folder slowly, his entire worldview visibly recalibrating. Why are you showing us all this? Just to prove me wrong? No, I said quietly. To establish that any financial discussion between us needs to be based on mutual respect and accurate value assessment. You dismissed my collection as worthless without making any effort to understand its true value. Now you're asking me to invest in your company without acknowledging our history. Mom reached across the table for my hand. Emma, I'm so sorry. We should have respected your property, your knowledge. I had no idea. Walter remained silent, processing the magnitude of his error. Finally, he looked up, his expression humbled in a way I'd never witnessed before. What are your terms? He asked simply. The question caught me off guard. I'd expected more resistance, perhaps anger or denial. Instead, Walter seemed to have accepted the new reality, that the stepdaughter whose passion he'd dismissed now held the financial power to save or sink his life's work. I haven't decided yet if I'm willing to help, I admitted. That depends on what I hear from you today. Walter nodded slowly, then did something unprecedented. He pushed his leather portfolio aside. Before we discuss any financial arrangement, he said, I owe you an apology, a real one. He took a deep breath. I was wrong about your collection. Wrong to dispose of it without your permission. Wrong to dismiss something that clearly had both financial and personal value to you. The words I'd waited 6 years to hear hung in the air between us. And? I prompted, needing more than just acknowledgement of financial miscalculation. And I was wrong about you, he continued, his voice roughening with emotion. I underestimated your knowledge, your determination, and your business acumen. The success you've built here proves that. It wasn't perfect, but it was perhaps the most genuine thing Walter had ever said to me. The admission seemed to physically cost him, his shoulders sagging with the weight of it. Thank you, I said simply. Mom looked between us, hope cautiously, dawning in her eyes. Does this mean? It means, I said, turning to the portfolio Walter had brought, that now we can begin the actual business discussion. Let's see exactly what we're dealing with at Simmons Construction. For the next 2 hours, we dissected the financial state of Simmons Construction. Walter spread documents across the conference table, balance sheets, project timelines, loan agreements, and legal notices. The picture they painted was grim, but not entirely hopeless. The Lakeside project is salvageable, Walter explained, pointing to environmental remediation estimates. The contamination is contained to the northwest quadrant, about 20% of the total property. If we can secure funding for the cleanup and keep the subcontractors from walking away, we could still complete the development. I studied the numbers with professional detachment, asking pointed questions about cash flow projections, outstanding liabilities, and contingency planning. Walter answered with surprising candor, no longer the dismissive stepfather, but a businessman, speaking to a potential investor. Your immediate need is $250,000, I confirmed, making notes. That would cover the most pressing subcontractor payments and provide operating capital while you negotiate with the bank. Yes, Walter agreed. With that bridge financing, I could likely secure a modified loan agreement. The bank doesn't want to foreclose. They'd take a significant loss if they did. But they need evidence of financial stability. Mom had remained largely silent during the financial discussion, watching the exchange between Walter and me with a mixture of anxiety and hope. When we took a short break, she followed me to the small kitchenette adjacent to the conference room. I've never seen Walter like this, she confided, helping me prepare fresh coffee. He's always been so certain, so unwilling to acknowledge mistakes. Financial desperation changes people, I noted, arranging cookies on a plate. It's more than that, Mom insisted. Seeing what you've built here, understanding what you accomplished despite his interference. I think he genuinely respects you now, Emma. I considered her words as we returned to the conference room. Respect from Walter had never been my goal. I'd long since stopped seeking his approval. Yet there was something undeniably satisfying about this role reversal, about watching him acknowledge my expertise in the very field he had once dismissed. Before we go further, I said as we resumed our seats, I need to address the elephant in the room. Why should I help you, Walter? Given our history? The blunt question hung in the air. Walter set down his coffee cup slowly. You shouldn't, he admitted, surprising me with his honesty. I wouldn't in your position. What I did was indefensible, both personally and, as you've made painfully clear, financially. Then why are you here? He glanced at Mom before answering. Partly for Catherine's sake. Your mother doesn't deserve to lose everything because of my mistakes. He paused, then added reluctantly, and partly because you're my best option. You understand what's at stake. You have the resources, and despite everything, we're family. The word sounded strained coming from him. In 6 years, I couldn't recall Walter ever referring to me as family before. Let's set aside personal considerations, I suggested. Speaking strictly as a potential investor, Simmons Construction represents a significant risk right now. The Lakeside project has major uncertainties, your cash flow is negative, and there are pending lawsuits from subcontractors. Walter nodded grimly. All true. However, I continued, the company has a 30-year track record, an established client base, and valuable equipment assets. With proper restructuring and adequate capitalization, it could return to profitability. Hope flickered in Walter's eyes. That's my assessment as well. So here's my proposition, I said, sliding a document across the table. Monroe Holdings, LLC, my investment company, will provide $250,000 in exchange for 30% equity in Simmons Construction and a position on the board of directors. Walter's eyebrows shot up. 30%? That's a controlling interest. Actually, it would be a minority stake, I corrected. You'd retain 70% ownership. But yes, it would give me significant input on major decisions. What kind of decisions? He asked cautiously. Financial oversight primarily. Approval of projects exceeding certain budget thresholds. Environmental due diligence protocols. I met his gaze steadily. The kind of checks and balances that might have prevented the Lakeside situation. Mom laid a hand on Walter's arm. It sounds reasonable, Walter. Emma has financial expertise we could benefit from. Walter studied the document, professional pride warring with financial necessity. And if I refuse? Then you find another investor, I said simply. I'm not your only option, just your most expedient one. The three of us sat in silence as Walter deliberated. Finally, he looked up. I'd like some modifications to these terms. A buyback option after 3 years, for instance. That can be arranged with appropriate valuation mechanisms, I conceded. My attorney can work with yours to finalize details. Walter extended his hand across the table. We have a preliminary agreement then. As we shook hands, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. This wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about transformation. The dynamic between Walter and me had fundamentally shifted. There's one more condition, I added, releasing his hand. A personal one, not a financial term. Walter tensed visibly. What is it? I want you to come with me somewhere after we conclude here. Where? He asked suspiciously. You'll see when we get there. An hour later, after discussing additional details of the proposed investment, I led Walter and Mom out of my office building to a waiting car. Neither questioned me as I directed the driver to the climate-controlled storage facility across town. What is this place? Walter asked as we approached the nondescript building. The secure location where I store my collection, I explained, entering an access code at the main entrance. You've seen the financial statements and a few sample pieces. Now I want you to understand exactly what you discarded and what I rebuilt. The industrial elevator carried us silently to the 5th floor. As the doors opened, I watched Walter's expression closely. The climate-controlled space before us spanned over 2,000 square feet, organized like a private museum with security systems more advanced than many financial institutions. Welcome to the Monroe Collection, I said, leading them inside. Mom gasped audibly as the full scope became apparent. Display cases lined the walls, organized by category and era. Museum-quality lighting illuminated each section, highlighting everything from rare comic books to vintage action figures, from first-edition novels to movie memorabilia. This is incredible, she whispered, moving toward a case containing my restored Star Wars collection. Walter stood motionless, his expression unreadable as he slowly surveyed the room. The magnitude of what he was seeing, of what he had dismissed and discarded, seemed to physically weigh on him. Every piece here has documented provenance and authentication, I explained, activating a tablet that controlled the display information system. Each item's purchase price, current market value, and appreciation rate are tracked in real time. I guided them through the collection methodically, explaining key pieces and their significance. Walter remained unusually quiet, absorbing everything, with an intensity I'd never witnessed in him before. When we reached the centerpiece display, my reconstructed comic book collection featuring the recovered Amazing Fantasy The Marsh 15, Walter finally spoke. I remember this, he said softly, studying the comic through the protective glass. You tried to tell me it was valuable. I thought you were exaggerating. This single comic is currently valued at $110,000, I noted. It's appreciated 120% since I reacquired it 5 years ago. Walter turned to face me directly. I was wrong, he said, the words clearly difficult for him. Not just about the monetary value, but about what this meant to you, about what you knew. Coming from Walter, this admission was more significant than any financial arrangement we might negotiate. 6 years ago, he had dismissed my knowledge without consideration. Today, he stood humbled before the evidence of my expertise. Thank you for showing me this, he said finally. I understand now what I didn't before. As we left the storage facility, the conversation shifted subtly. We were no longer stepfather and stepdaughter locked in old patterns of resentment and dismissal. We had become something new. Business associates with a complex shared history moving tentatively toward mutual respect. I'll have my attorney draft the formal investment agreement, I told Walter as we parted ways at my apartment building. We should be able to transfer funds by the end of next week, assuming the terms are acceptable. Walter nodded, then hesitated. The money will save my company, Emma. But what happened today? Seeing what you've built, understanding what I failed to see before, That might have saved something more important. As their taxi pulled away, Mom waved goodbye, her expression lighter than I'd seen in years. The weight of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings had finally begun to lift. Inside my apartment, I gazed at the framed photograph on my wall, Dad and me at my first comic convention, both of us beaming with excitement over a newly acquired collectible. The journey from that moment to today had been longer and more complex than either of us could have imagined. "We did it, Dad," I whispered to the photographer. "We built something that lasts." 6 months after our agreement, I stood beside Walter at the Lakeside Estates construction site, watching workers complete the environmental remediation. Spring had arrived in Mapleton, bringing with it new growth and unexpected changes. "The EPA inspector is scheduled for Thursday," Walter informed me, consulting his tablet. "If we get clearance, we can resume regular construction next Monday." I nodded, making a note in my own files. As a board member and significant investor in Simmons Construction, I now visited Mapleton monthly for progress reviews and strategic planning. What had begun as a strictly business arrangement had evolved into something more nuanced. "The modified architectural plans look good," I observed, gesturing toward the area previously contaminated. "Converting that section to green space and community gardens actually enhances the overall development." Walter smiled wryly. "Who would have thought an environmental crisis would end up improving the project? The pre-sales on the residential units facing the new garden space are our strongest category." This was the most surprising development of all. Walter not only accepting my input, but actually valuing it. The man who had once dismissed my interests now regularly sought my perspective on design choices, market positioning, and financial projections. "The bank seems pleased with our progress," he continued as we walked back to the site office. "Their representative mentioned potentially expanding our credit line if the EPA gives us the all-clear." "That would allow us to accelerate the commercial phase," I noted. "The market analysis suggests there's significant demand for the retail spaces." Inside the office, a framed article from the Mapleton Business Journal hung on the wall. "Simmons. Construction rebounds with new direction." The piece detailed the company's recovery from near bankruptcy and highlighted the strategic partnership with Boston-based Monroe Holdings LLC, bringing fresh capital and innovative perspectives to the established firm. What the article didn't mention was the personal history behind that partnership, the journey from dismissal to recognition that had made it possible. Later that evening, Mom hosted dinner at their home, a tradition that had developed during my monthly visits. The atmosphere had changed dramatically since my first tense return to Mapleton. Where awkward silences and careful avoidance of sensitive topics had once prevailed, genuine conversation now flowed. "I signed the lease on the new office space today," I announced as Mom served dessert. "Monroe Authentication Services will officially open its Mapleton branch next month." "That's wonderful, honey," Mom exclaimed. "Will you be splitting your time between here and Boston?" "Initially," I confirmed. "Daria will manage the Boston office day-to-day while I establish the new location. Eventually, I'll hire a local team here." The decision to expand my business to Mapleton had emerged organically over recent months. The Midwest location offered both practical advantages: lower operating costs, proximity to several major collector markets, and personal ones. "I have a proposition for you regarding the new office," Walter said, setting down his coffee cup. "The ground floor retail space in Building 3 at Lakeside will be ready in about 4 months. It has excellent security features, natural light, and high visibility. It would be perfect for your authentication business." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me space in your development?" "I'm offering you first right of refusal at preferred investor rates," he clarified. "Strictly a business proposition. The location would benefit both our companies." Mom glanced between us, still occasionally marveling at the transformed dynamic. "It would be wonderful to have you working closer to home, Emma." Home. The word resonated unexpectedly. Mapleton hadn't felt like home since Dad died, certainly not since Walter had discarded my collection. Yet somehow, through the most unlikely circumstances, I was rebuilding connections here just as I had rebuilt my collection. "I'll consider it," I told Walter. "Send me the specifications and terms." After dinner, Walter retreated to his office to prepare for an early meeting while Mom and I shared tea in the living room. Another new tradition. These quiet conversations had gradually healed wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged. "I found something I want you to have," Mom said, retrieving a small wooden box from the sideboard. "I discovered it last week while cleaning out the attic." She placed the box in my hands. The moment my fingers touched the worn wood, recognition flooded through me. "Dad's collection log," I whispered. Inside the box lay a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. This was where Dad had first taught me to catalog our finds, recording each item's description, condition, and acquisition details. "Thought Walter had thrown everything away," I said, carefully opening the fragile notebook. "This was in a box of your father's personal papers," Mom explained. "Things I set aside before the donations. I should have given it to you years ago, but it got misplaced in the movie." The first page bore Dad's neat handwriting. "Monroe, Family Collection, established 1992. Below, in childish script, I had added, "Emma plus Dad's treasure hunt." Tears pricked my eyes as I turned the pages, finding the earliest entries from our collecting journey. A set of baseball cards from a yard sale, 2 action figures found at a flea market, a comic book purchased for $5 that Dad had noted might be worth watching. "He would be so proud of you, Emma," Mom said softly. "Not just for rebuilding the collection, but for transforming it into something beyond what either of you imagined." I closed the notebook gently. "Thank you for finding this. It means more than I can say." The following weekend, Mr. Russo hosted a special event at his expanded shop, now officially designated as an authorized affiliate of Monroe Authentication Services. Collectors from 3 states gathered for a valuation clinic, bringing their treasured items for expert assessment. "Never thought I'd see Mapleton become a destination for serious collectors," Mr. Russo remarked as we prepared for the event. "Your father would have loved this." I surveyed the transformed shop, with its professional display cases, authentication equipment, and the small museum area featuring rotating exhibits from my collection. He always said collecting was about more than ownership. It was about preservation and education. The event exceeded our expectations, drawing over 100 participants and generating substantial media coverage. Among the attendees, somewhat to my surprise, was Walter. "I'm not here to get anything valued," he explained when I spotted him examining a display of vintage advertising memorabilia. "Just wanted to see your operation firsthand. It's impressive." Coming from Walter, this simple acknowledgement represented a journey measured not in dollars, but in understanding. The man who had once deemed my passion worthless now stood in a room full of evidence to the contrary. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," I said, leading him to a quiet corner where an elderly gentleman carefully examined a set of rare coins. "Mr. Hargrove, this is my stepfather, Walter Simmons." The distinguished collector looked up, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Ah, yes. Emma has mentioned you." His tone carried no judgment, just simple acknowledgement. "Mr. Hargrove serves on the National Authentication Standards Board," I explained to Walter. "He's also one of my most valued clients and mentors. Your daughter has revolutionized authentication protocols for pop culture memorabilia," Hargrove told Walter. "Her methodologies are becoming industry standard, quite remarkable for someone so young." Walter glanced at me, genuine pride evident in his expression. "Yes, she is remarkable, though I can't take any credit for her success." "Perhaps not directly," Hargrove mused, "but adversity often shapes excellence. Emma's determination to rebuild what was lost created something far greater than what existed before." As we walked back to the main event area, Walter surprised me by asking, "Do you think I could learn more about this? Not to interfere," he added quickly, "but to understand what you do. What makes these things valuable beyond their price tags?" The request reflected a fundamental shift, a willingness to step into my world rather than dismissing it from his. "I think that could be arranged," I replied. 1 year to the day after our investment agreement was signed, I invited Walter to the storage facility housing my Boston collection. Unlike our first visit, this time he came alone. At my request, "I have something to show you," I explained, leading him to a newly installed display case. "This just arrived yesterday." Inside the case sat a familiar object, a vintage Superman action figure still in its original packaging. It was unmistakably from my original collection. I recognized the small imperfection on the corner of the box. "This is from," Walter began, his voice trailing off. "Yes," I confirmed. "One of the pieces you donated. Mr. Russo tracked it down through a collector in Michigan." Walter studied the figure silently, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. "What is it worth?" he finally asked. "Financially? About $7,000, I answered. "Personally, much more." He nodded slowly, understanding the dual valuation. "Thank you for showing me this, for helping me understand what I couldn't see before." As we stood before the display case, I realized we had both found something valuable through this unlikely journey. Not just financial stability or professional respect, but a chance to rebuild what had seemed irreparably broken, like the collection that surrounded us. Our relationship had been damaged, discarded, and eventually reconstructed into something different, but perhaps more valuable than before. Not because we forgot the past, but because we finally acknowledged its true worth. 3 years after our investment agreement, the rooftop garden of Lakeside's central building hosted a dual celebration. The final phase of the development was complete, and Monroe Authentication Services was opening its flagship Midwest headquarters in the building's ground floor. Sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink as guests mingled among display pedestals showcasing select pieces from what was now known in collector circles as the Monroe Legacy Collection. For this special event, I'd brought together items that told not just the story of pop culture memorabilia, but of perseverance, recognition, and reconciliation. "Emma, the exhibition design is spectacular," remarked Dr. Winters, who had flown in from Syracuse for the occasion. "I'm especially impressed by the educational elements. Each display included not just the item itself, but information about its cultural significance, authentication markers, and value evolution over time. The exhibition embodied Dad's philosophy that collecting was as much about education as acquisition." "Mike, incorporating these modules into our new collector education program," I explained. "We're launching workshops for young collectors next month." Across the rooftop, Walter guided a group of business associates through the displays, explaining the authentication process with surprising fluency. Over the past 3 years, he had developed a genuine interest in collecting, even starting a modest collection of vintage construction and architectural memorabilia. "Your stepfather has become quite the advocate," Dr. Winters observed with amusement. "Quite a transformation from the man you described in your college days." Indeed, Walter had undergone a remarkable evolution. After our initial investment saved Simmons Construction, he had approached our business relationship with unexpected openness. The board meetings that I'd expected to be contentious proved increasingly collaborative as Walter recognized the value of my perspective. Most surprisingly, he had become an enthusiastic supporter of Monroe Authentication Services, referring clients and even helping design the security systems for our new headquarters. "The market for authenticated memorabilia has grown 32% annually since we opened the Mapleton branch," Jackson reported, joining our conversation. Now my business partner and chief valuation officer, he had relocated to help manage our expanding Midwest operations. "We're receiving authentication requests from museums now, not just private collectors," he added. The Smithsonian has approached us about developing protocols for their pop culture acquisitions. Mom appeared at my side, elegant in a blue dress chosen specifically for the occasion. "Your father would be so proud, Emma," she said, slipping her arm through mine. "Not just of your success, but of how you've shared your knowledge." The educational initiative had been my most personally meaningful project, a series of programs designed to teach young collectors about authentication, preservation, and valuation. Each participant received a starter kit modeled after the notebook Dad had created for me, updated with modern resources and documentation techniques. "We've enrolled 50 students in the first workshop series," I told her. "Mr. Russo is co-teaching the comic book authentication segment." The crowd's attention shifted as Walter tapped a glass for announcements. As he thanked everyone for attending and acknowledged key contributors to the Lakeside project, I reflected on how profoundly our relationship had changed. The resentment that had once defined my feelings toward him had gradually transformed into something resembling respect, not just for his business acumen, but for his willingness to recognize his mistakes and grow from them. "And now," Walter concluded, "I'd like to invite Emma Monroe to say a few words about her remarkable company and its new home here at Lakeside." As I took my place beside him, Walter handed me a small package wrapped in simple blue paper. "A small token for the occasion," he said quietly. Curious, I unwrapped it carefully to find a custom display case containing a familiar action figure, a vintage G.I. Joe still in its original packaging, identical to the first collectible Dad and I had purchased together at a flea market 30 years ago. "How did you—" I began, recognizing it as one of the few pieces from my original collection I had never been able to locate. "It took some detective work," Walter admitted, "and a lot of help from Mr. Russo. Apparently, it ended up in a collector's showcase in Tulsa. When he learned the story, he agreed to sell it back." The gesture represented far more than the return of a valuable collectible. It acknowledged our shared history, the pain, the loss, but also the growth and rebuilding that had followed. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing he understood the depth behind those words. Turning to address our guests, I placed the display case on the podium. "This figure represents where my journey began, with my father teaching me to see value where others saw only toys. Today, it symbolizes something more. The understanding that true worth isn't always visible at first glance, and sometimes what we dismiss as worthless may prove to be our most valuable asset." The reception continued as twilight deepened into evening. The Lakeside complex, once nearly Walter's financial ruin, now stood as a testament to reinvention. The illuminated gardens, residential towers, and commercial spaces created a small community where there had once been abandoned industrial land. Similarly, Monroe Authentication Services had evolved from a personal mission of reclamation into a nationally recognized authority on cultural artifacts, with education programs, authentication protocols, and valuation services that extended far beyond my initial vision. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, I found myself standing with Walter at the rooftop's edge, gazing out over the development. "I've been thinking about succession planning," he said unexpectedly, "for Simmons Construction." "You're not planning to retire already?" I asked, surprised. "Not immediately," he clarified, "but eventually. The company needs a long-term vision, someone who can take it in new directions when I step back." I nodded, assuming he was considering external candidates or perhaps consulting firms that specialized in business transitions. "You've transformed how I see value, Emma," he continued, "not just in collectibles, but in business opportunities, in property development, in people's potential. I'd like you to consider taking a more significant role in Simmons Construction's future." The proposal caught me completely off guard. "Walter, I don't have a background in construction management." "No," he agreed. "But you understand investment, value, market timing, and long-term asset appreciation better than anyone I know." The technical aspects can be learned or delegated. As we discussed possibilities, I realized how dramatically our positions had reversed. The man who had once dismissed my expertise now sought to entrust me with his life's work. The junk collection he had discarded had led directly to the business acumen he now valued above all else. Dad had been right all along. Today's trash truly could become tomorrow's treasure. But the most valuable transformation wasn't in the collection I had rebuilt, or even the business I had created. It was in the recognition that had finally come, the validation of a passion once dismissed, and the healing of wounds I had thought would remain forever open. "I'll think about it," I promised Walter. "But whatever happens next, we've built something worthwhile here, together." Above us, stars emerged in the darkening sky, witnesses to an unlikely reconciliation that had transformed dismissal into respect, loss into creation, and ultimately, adversity into legacy. 5 years to the day after Walter had first sought my financial help, I stood in the newly completed Monroe Cultural Preservation Center, surveying what had once seemed impossible. The 15,000-square-foot facility, built on the eastern edge of the lakeside development, represented the culmination of a vision that had evolved far beyond my original goal of simply rebuilding what was lost. "The interactive authentication stations are installed and calibrated," reported Melissa, now my chief operating officer after leaving her law career to join Monroe Enterprises. "The educational wing opens to students next week." The center housed not just my expanded collection, now professionally curated and valued at over $2 million, but also served as a teaching facility, authentication laboratory, and cultural preservation institute. What had begun as a personal quest for vindication had transformed into a mission to share knowledge and preserve cultural artifacts for future generations. "Registration for the summer workshops is already at capacity," Melissa continued, scrolling through data on her tablet. "And the University Partnership Program has applicants from 12 states." I nodded with satisfaction. The partnership with Syracuse University's Museum Studies program, suggested by Dr. Winters before her retirement, had created pathways for students interested in cultural authentication and preservation. Each year, we selected 10 fellows for intensive training in valuation methodologies, authentication techniques, and collection management. "Has Walter confirmed for the board meeting tomorrow?" I asked, checking my watch. The joint board of Monroe Simmons Holdings, the parent company we had formed 2 years earlier, was scheduled to finalize plans for our newest venture. Yes, though he mentioned he might be slightly late. Something about showing a potential client the Westridge site. I smiled at this detail. Though Walter had gradually reduced his day-to-day involvement in construction operations, he still personally handled certain aspects of project development, particularly site selection and initial client consultations. At 64, he had found a comfortable balance between active leadership and strategic oversight. Our business relationship had evolved in unexpected ways after I accepted Walter's invitation to take a larger role in Simmons Construction. Rather than simply increasing my equity stake, we had created a holding company that integrated both our businesses, leveraging the strengths of each while maintaining their distinct identities. Monroe Authentication Services had expanded to 7 locations nationwide, while Simmons Construction had diversified into specialized development focusing on cultural and educational facilities. Our most recent projects included museum expansions, university research centers, and specialized storage facilities for institutional collections. As I walked through the center's main exhibition hall, I paused before a special display case positioned prominently near the entrance. Unlike the other cases, which showcased rare collectibles with detailed authentication information, this one told a personal story. Inside, arranged chronologically, were items that traced my journey. Dad's original collection notebook, photographs of our weekend treasure hunts, the inventory sheets from my first collection, newspaper clippings about Monroe authentication services, and the G.I. Joe figure Walter had returned to me at the lakeside opening. A small plaque beside. The case read simply, "The value of second chances, how loss became legacy." "Reminiscing again?" asked a familiar voice. I turned to find Mom approaching, elegant as always despite recent health challenges. At 70, she had slowed somewhat but remained actively involved in the center's community outreach programs. "Just appreciating how far we've come," I replied, embracing her. "Your father would be absolutely astounded," she said, gazing around the exhibition hall. "Not just by all this, but by how his simple hobby with you grew into something that impacts so many people." We walked together through the educational wing, where teaching spaces were equipped with advanced authentication technology and preservation equipment. Next week, 20 high school students would begin our inaugural Young Collectors program, a 6-week course teaching valuation, authentication, and collecting ethics. "Have you spoken with Walter today?" Mom asked as we entered the research library, where reference materials on collectibles of all categories filled custom-built shelves. "Not yet. He's finalizing details on the Westridge project." "He's excited about your announcement at tomorrow's board meeting," she said with a knowing smile, "though he's trying to play it cool." The announcement had been months in planning, the formal launch of the Monroe Simmons Foundation, dedicated to preserving cultural artifacts and supporting emerging authenticators and appraisers. Walter and I would serve as co-chairs with an initial endowment of $5 million drawn from both our company's profits. "It's still strange sometimes," I admitted, working so closely with him after everything that happened. "If you had told me 6 years ago that Walter and I would be building something together." "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Mom observed. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes." That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my home, a restored Victorian near downtown Mapleton that I'd purchased after deciding to split my time between Boston and Ohio. The guest list included the key people who had supported my journey: Mr. Russo, Jackson and his wife, Daria, who still managed our Boston operations, and Walter and Mom. As we gathered around the dining table, the conversation flowed easily between business developments, collecting stories, and personal updates. I watched Walter engage in animated discussion with Mr. Russo about a recent authentication challenge involving promotional movie posters, a conversation that would have been inconceivable years earlier. "I have something for everyone," I announced after dessert was served, distributing small wrapped packages. "A commemoration of our journey together." Inside each box was a custom-made challenge coin, a collector's item in itself. One side featured the logo of Monroe Simmons Holdings, while the reverse displayed the words, "Value Transforms," surrounding a stylized phoenix rising from a collection of vintage toys, comics, and memorabilia. "These are minted from recycled silver," I explained. "Each one is uniquely numbered and authenticated, of course." Walter turned his coin over in his hand, studying the craftsmanship with genuine appreciation. "Remarkable detail," he noted. "These will become collectibles in their own right." "That's the plan," I confirmed. "We're releasing a limited public edition next month to commemorate the center's opening. Proceeds will fund scholarships for the HE education programs." After our guests departed, Walter lingered behind, asking to speak with me privately. We settled in my home office, where display cases housed my most personally significant pieces, not necessarily the most valuable financially, but those with the deepest connections to Dad and our collecting journey. "I've been thinking about our story," Walter said, his tone reflective, "about how close I came to missing everything that's happened these past few years." "What do you mean?" "If I hadn't thrown away your collection, you might never have developed your authentication expertise to the degree you did. If my business hadn't faced a crisis, we might never have formed our partnership." He shook his head slowly. "My worst mistake led to our greatest success." The observation carried profound truth. The path that had brought us here, from dismissal to desperation to mutual respect, could never have been planned or anticipated. "I've drafted my will," Walter continued, changing direction. "I'm leaving my ownership stake in the holding company. To you, not just Mom. You've earned the right to determine its future." The gesture represented the final transformation in our relationship, from stepfather who dismissed my passion to business partner who trusted me with his legacy. "Thank you," I said simply, though I hope that decision remains theoretical for many years. As Walter prepared to leave, he paused before the display case containing the first item I had ever authenticated professionally, a rare promotional Darth Vader figure that had launched my career in valuation. "You know what amazes me most?" he reflected. "Not just the financial success or the business we've built. It's that you never lost sight of why this mattered to you. The connection to your father, the joy of preservation, the satisfaction of recognition." His insight surprised me. For years, I had assumed Walter's perspective was exclusively financial, that he had come to respect my collection solely because of its monetary value. This recognition of the deeper meaning behind my work suggested a more profound understanding than I had credited him with. "Dad always said collecting wasn't just about owning things," I replied. "It was about preserving stories, connecting to history, recognizing values others missed." Walter nodded thoughtfully, a wisdom I was too stubborn to appreciate until recently. He extended his hand, the challenge coin visible in his palm. "To value transformation, in collections and in people." As I shook his hand, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this moment. The stepfather who had discarded my worthless junk now wore a lapel pin featuring a vintage comic book character. The businessman who had once dismissed collecting as childish now co-chaired a foundation dedicated to cultural preservation. And I, who had once defined myself through resentment of his actions, had found not just professional success, but personal resolution through our transformed relationship. The collection Walter had thrown away, worth $900,000 when he needed a $250,000 loan, had become something far more valuable than either of us could have imagined. A bridge between our different worlds, a foundation for shared purpose, and ultimately, a legacy that would outlast us both. 10 years after Walter first came to me for financial help, a surprising discovery changed our story once again. The Monroe Cultural Preservation Center had become nationally recognized, hosting traveling exhibitions, authentication conferences, and educational programs that drew participants from around the world. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was reviewing acquisition proposals in my office when my assistant interrupted with an unusual message. "There's an elderly gentleman in the reception area," she explained. "He says he needs to speak with you personally about the Goodwill donation from a decade ago. He's quite insistent." Curious, I made my way to the lobby where a man in his 70s waited, clutching a worn leather portfolio. His weathered face brightened when he saw me. "Ms. Monroe? I'm Harold Blackwood, former regional director for Goodwill Industries in Ohio." He extended a hand. "I've been trying to track you down for nearly 2 years. I invited him to my office, intrigued by his mention of the donation that had changed my life." Once seated, he carefully opened his portfolio. "After I retired from Goodwill, I began working on a history of notable donations to our organization," he explained. "While researching, I came across records from 2015 regarding a large donation of collectibles from Walter Simmons." My pulse quickened. Yes, that was my collection, donated without my consent. "That's what makes this situation so unusual," Harold said, extracting a folder of documents. "According to our protocols, donations of that volume should have been processed centrally and documented thoroughly, but it appears the majority of your items were diverted before reaching our sorting facility." "Diverted?" I echoed, confused. "What exactly does that mean?" Someone intercepted the bulk of your collection before it entered our system. Only a fraction of what Mr. Simmons donated ever reached our sales floor. This revelation hit me like a physical shock. For years, I'd operated under the assumption that my entire collection had been randomly dispersed through Goodwill stores, purchased by unaware shoppers or knowledgeable collectors who recognized their value. How is that possible? And why are you just discovering this now? Harold sighed heavily. The employee who handled the intake that day, Marcus Finley, had worked for us for 15 years. He was considered absolutely trustworthy. We had no reason to suspect anything until recently, when discrepancies in our historical records emerged during my research. He slid a document across the desk, a copy of the original donation receipt signed by Walter. Attached was a multi-page inventory with far more items than I had ever managed to recover. We believe Finley recognized the value of what was being donated and diverted most of it for personal gain. He left Goodwill rather abruptly about 3 months after this donation, citing family reasons. My mind raced, calculating the implications. If the bulk of my collection hadn't been randomly dispersed, but had instead been deliberately intercepted— "Have you located this Marcus Finley?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's part of why I'm here," Harold replied. "We traced him to Portland, Oregon, where he opened a vintage collectibles shop called Retro Treasures shortly after leaving Goodwill. The timing and business focus raised red flags during our investigation." He produced several printed pages, screenshots, from a website showing a small storefront and display cases filled with vintage toys, comics, and memorabilia. My heart nearly stopped when I spotted several items in the photographs that I instantly recognized from my original collection. "That's my Star Trek commemorative set," I whispered, pointing to a distinctive display in one image. "And that Batman promotional figure was custom signed by the artist. It's one of a kind." Harold nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. Unfortunately, Finley closed the shop and disappeared about 18 months ago, shortly after selling the business to new owners. The current proprietors purchased only the storefront and fixtures, not the inventory. So my collection may still be in Finley's possession, or could have been sold through private channels. The good news is that our legal team has been building a case. With your authentication expertise and documentation of your original collection, we might be able to trace and recover some of these items." I sat back, overwhelmed by this unexpected twist. After 10 years of believing my collection had been randomly scattered to the winds, the possibility that a significant portion might have been deliberately taken and might still be intact was staggering. "I'll need to discuss this with my stepfather," I said finally. "He was the one who made the donation." Harold seemed surprised. "I was under the impression your relationship was strained." "It was," I acknowledged. "But things have changed considerably." After Harold left, providing all his contact information and copies of his documentation, I sat alone in my office, processing this revelation. The irony wasn't lost on me. After building a nationally recognized authentication business and amassing a collection worth over $3 million, I was suddenly confronted with the possibility of recovering pieces of my original collection that had been presumed lost forever. I called Walter, asking him to meet me as soon as possible. When he arrived at the center an hour later, I explained Harold Blackwood's visit and the implications of his discovery. "So this Goodwill employee essentially stole your collection before it could even be processed?" Walter asked, examining the documents with growing concern. "It appears so," I confirmed. "Which means some significant portion of my original collection might still exist as a unit somewhere." Walter's expression darkened with anger. Not the defensive anger he might have shown years ago, but protective indignation on my behalf. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "If I hadn't been so dismissive, so arrogant about your childish collection, none of this would have happened." "We've moved past that," I reminded him. "What matters now is what we do with this information." We spent the next hour formulating a plan. Walter, drawing on contacts from his decades in business, would hire a private investigator to track down Marcus Finley. I would compile comprehensive documentation of my original collection, including any identifying features that would definitively prove ownership. "There's a certain poetry to this," Walter observed as we reviewed our strategy. "Your expertise in authentication and provenance documentation, skills you developed specifically because of what happened, might now be the key to recovering what was taken." "Life does seem to come full circle sometimes," I agreed. That evening, I opened my climate-controlled storage vault and retrieved the leather-bound journal containing my original inventory. Each carefully documented entry now represented not just a memory or a lesson learned, but potentially recoverable property. As I photographed pages for the investigator, I realized that this unexpected development had completed my emotional journey, in a way I hadn't anticipated. The loss of my collection had initially fueled resentment, then determination, and eventually success beyond anything I'd imagined. Now, the possibility of recovery offered not just the return of cherished items, but a final resolution to the story Walter and I had been writing together over the past decade. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting of the Monroe Simmons Foundation Board to establish a new initiative, the Reclamation Project, dedicated to helping collectors recover lost or stolen items through expert authentication and legal support. "This isn't just about my collection anymore," I explained to the board members. "This experience has revealed a larger issue affecting collectors everywhere. The need for resources to trace and recover misappropriated cultural artifacts." Walter, seated beside me as co-chair, added his endorsement. "Emma turned her personal loss into professional triumph years ago. Now she's transforming this new challenge into an opportunity to help others. The Foundation should absolutely support this initiative." As the meeting concluded with unanimous approval, I realized that the journey that had begun with Walter throwing away my junk collection had evolved in ways neither of us could have possibly imagined, from personal tragedy to professional success. From broken trust to strengthened bonds, and now, from assumed permanent loss to potential recovery and broader purpose. Whatever the outcome of our search for Marcus Finley and my original collection, the story had already come full circle, in the most meaningful way possible. 18 months after Harold Blackwood's revelation, I stood in a climate-controlled warehouse in Seattle, surrounded by stacked storage containers bearing evidence seals. The private investigator Walter had hired, a remarkably persistent former FBI agent named Diana Reeves, had finally located Marcus Finley living under an assumed name in a small coastal town in Washington state. We found him through a series of high-value insurance policies he took out on what he claimed was his lifelong collection, Diana explained as we waited for the legal team to arrive. The documentation he provided to the insurance company included photographs matching items from your inventory. The ensuing legal battle had been complex but decisive. Once presented with overwhelming evidence, my detailed original inventory, photographs, authentication reports, and even the testimony of Harold Blackwood regarding the suspicious timing of Finley's departure from Goodwill, Finley had eventually agreed to a settlement rather than face criminal charges. "Ms. Monroe?" called a voice from the warehouse entrance. "We're ready to begin the verification process." The next 8 hours passed in a blur of careful unpacking, methodical documentation, and waves of emotion I hadn't anticipated. Container after container revealed pieces of my original collection, many still in the protective cases I had used, some still bearing my handwritten labels. "The amazing fantasy Tour 15, I whispered, carefully lifting the comic book from its archival sleeve. And it's still in the same preservation case. Walter, who had flown in from Ohio specifically for this recovery operation, watched quietly from a few feet away, his expression a mixture of regret and wonder. "How much of it is here?" he asked as I meticulously documented each item. "Based on my preliminary assessment, About 70% of the original collection, I replied, carefully examining a set of vintage Star Wars figures. Primarily the most valuable pieces, which makes sense. Finley seems to have recognized which items had significant worth. By evening, we had verified and documented 253 items from my original collection, with an estimated current value of approximately $1.2 million, significantly more than the $900,000 valuation that had so shocked Walter years earlier. "What will you do with it all?" Walter asked as we supervised the secure loading of the verified items for transport back to the Monroe Preservation Center in Ohio. It was a question I had been pondering since the investigation began. The young woman who had so desperately wanted to rebuild her lost collection was long gone, transformed into someone whose relationship with collecting had evolved far beyond personal ownership. "I'm going to establish a permanent exhibition," I decided. "The Lost and Found collection, telling the story from beginning to end. Not just about the items themselves, but about how their loss and recovery shaped everything that came after." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "A teaching collection." "Exactly. These pieces have already taught me more than I ever could have imagined, about value, persistence, reinvention, and forgiveness. Now they can teach others." 3 months later, the Monroe Preservation Center unveiled its newest wing, a 5,000-square-foot exhibition space dedicated to the Lost and Found collection. The opening night gala drew collectors, museum curators, and authentication specialists from across the country, along with the local supporters who had been part of my journey from the beginning. Mr. Russo, now in his 80s but still sharp, as ever, beamed with pride as he toured the exhibits. "Your father would have been so proud, Emma, not just of the collection, but of everything you've built from it." The exhibition had been designed to tell a comprehensive story. The first section displayed my original collection, now fully recovered and restored, with detailed information about each item's cultural significance and market value. The second section documented the loss and rebuilding process, including my development of authentication methodologies and the founding of Monroe Authentication Services. The final section showcased the reclamation project, which had already helped 3 other collectors recover significant pieces through the Foundation's resources. As I guided visitors through the exhibition, I found myself pausing before a special display at the center of the main gallery. Inside the custom-built case sat 3 items that symbolized my journey. Dad's original collection notebook, the GI, Joe figure Walter had returned to me years earlier, and the legal settlement document from Marcus Finley. "These 3 pieces tell the real story," I explained to a group of young collectors attending through our educational program. "The beginning, the transformation, and the resolution." Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, I found Walter sitting, alone on a bench in the exhibition's final gallery, studying a wall of photographs documenting the growth of Monroe Simmons Holdings over the past decade. "Penny, for your thoughts?" I asked, joining him. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out," he replied quietly. "If I hadn't been so dismissive of your collection, if I hadn't donated it without your permission, if my business hadn't faced crisis." He gestured around us at the impressive facility. "None of this might exist." "True," I acknowledged. "But I've learned that dwelling on what-ifs isn't nearly as productive as focusing on what now." Walter smiled at the gentle redirection. "And what now, Emma? With the original collection recovered and the Monroe Simmons Enterprises thriving, what's your next challenge?" It was a good question. One I had been contemplating since the recovery of my collection had brought a sense of completion to a journey that had defined a significant portion of my adult life. "I'm establishing a national authentication standard," I revealed. "The Foundation is partnering with 3 major universities to create certification programs for authentication specialists, focusing initially on cultural artifacts and collectibles, but eventually expanding to fine art and historical documents. Creating a professional pathway for others to follow in your footsteps," Walter observed. turning your personal expertise into an established field. Exactly. Authentication has existed in pockets of specialty for years, but there's no unified approach or recognized credentialing. We have an opportunity to transform the entire field. The next morning, I arrived early at the center to find Mom waiting in my office. At 75, she had reduced her involvement in day-to-day operations, but remained an important advisor and supporter. "I have something for you," she said, placing a small box on my desk. I found it while going through some old storage containers in the attic. Inside was a faded photograph I had never seen before. Dad and me at what appeared to be my very first flea market visit. My tiny hand clutching the G.I. Joe figure that had started our collecting journey. I couldn't have been more than 6 years old, my expression a mixture of excitement and reverence as I examined my treasure. "Your father took you to that flea market as a special treat after you recovered from strep throat," Mom explained, her voice soft with memory. "He had no idea it would spark such a passion in you. He just wanted to share something he enjoyed." I studied the photograph, seeing in that moment the seed of everything that had followed. Not just the collection itself, but the values Dad had instilled through our shared hobby: appreciation for history, recognition of overlooked value, the patience to build something meaningful piece by piece. That afternoon, I added the photograph to the central display case, completing the story in a way that felt perfect. The circle that had begun with a father sharing his passion with his daughter had expanded to include loss and recovery, crisis and opportunity, dismissal and recognition, ultimately growing large enough to encompass not just my personal journey, but a legacy that would continue beyond me. Walter's dismissal of my junk collection had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that transformed both our lives. His financial crisis had created an opportunity for recognition and reconciliation neither of us could have anticipated. The recovery of my original collection had brought not just restoration of what was lost, but affirmation of everything that had been gained along the way. As I watched a group of young collectors being guided through the exhibition, absorbing the story and lessons it contained, I recognized the most valuable truth my journey had revealed: that sometimes our greatest challenges create our most meaningful opportunities, that what seems like an ending can become a beginning, and that the true worth of any collection, whether of objects, experiences, or relationships, lies not in its monetary value, but in its capacity to transform both the collector and those whose lives they touch. The basement collection Walter had dismissed as worthless had ultimately proven valuable beyond any price tag, not just for the rare items it contained, but for the purpose, passion, and reconciliation it had created. The journey that began with loss had culminated in something far more precious than anything that had been taken away: a legacy of recognition, restoration, and profound growth that would continue to ripple outward long after the story of my junk collection had been told. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.